In 1978, America's biggest city came close to a complete and utter disaster. This was once one of the tallest buildings in New York, but for years it had a terrible secret, an engineering flaw that meant with the right gust of wind, it could have blown over. Wind the clock back to July 1978, and under the cover of darkness, construction teams here are working non-stop all through the night to secretly reinforce this skyscraper. There's a hurricane on the way that, if it makes landfall, could destroy this building.
It wouldn't collapse, it would topple left or right. It could be a domino effect, which could in turn collapse into further buildings, and it could have been an absolute nightmare.
Emergency responders are on standby to evacuate the 10 blocks surrounding the skyscraper, and 3 different weather services are employed to monitor the winds 24/7 in case of any sudden changes. Winds strong enough to topple this building blow through New York City once every 16 years. If they were to hit this skyscraper on one of its corners, it would fall, and not just flatten everything around it, but potentially create a chain reaction toppling skyscraper after skyscraper. In one of the densest cities in the world, the human cost, the damage would be unimaginable. And no one in the city knows anything about this, not even the people who go to work in the tower every day.
I would definitely empathize with that stomach through the floor moment of realizing that there could be a serious problem.
The reason for all this, the person who discovered this enormous engineering flaw, well, it wasn't the structural engineer behind the skyscraper. It was a student who was doing her thesis project on tall buildings. And we got the story from her firsthand.
My name is Diane Hartley, and in 1978, I was a student of civil engineering, structural engineering at Princeton University.
This is the story of the race to stop one of New York's tallest skyscrapers from collapsing.
So, how on earth could one of the tallest buildings in the world at the time have such a fatal flaw in its engineering that once every 16 years, strong winds could knock it straight over? This is the Citicorp Centre, later renamed the City Group Centre, or simply 601 Lexington. Looking at it on the New York skyline, it's not particularly evident why it would have a structural flaw. In fact, it looks like a pretty ordinary building, with an angled crown to help it stand out a bit from New York's other Goliaths. It's when we drop down to street level that we discover one of the most bizarre skyscraper bases in history.
Now, you might notice that the Citigroup Tower is built on stilts. That's not an aesthetic choice, though it is pretty cool to walk under it.
To help explain why, we've talked to 2 additional experts on the building.
My name's Donald Friedman. I'm a structural engineer based in New York. I spent the first few years of my career designing new tall buildings, including a few in New York.
We also talked to Michael Greenberg, author of The Great Miscalculation, The Race to Save New York City's Citicorp Tower.
I started thinking about heroes and how we reflect upon what is a hero. And I stumbled upon William LeMessurier. His was an anomaly. He's a hero because he blew the whistle on himself.
Citicorp Tower was built at a time of great unrest in New York City.
The building attracted a lot of attention when it was under construction in the late 70s, in part because there had been, both nationwide and here in New York, there had been a bad recession. And when there are no big new buildings built in New York for a few years, everybody starts getting a little itchy because, that's what we do, is we build.
There was a lot of strife in the city at the time. It was a time where a lot of businesses were fleeing. And Citicorp, through its chairman, Walter Wriston, had made the decision that they were going to remain in the city, invest in the city.
Citicorp's CEO Walter Wriston was a fearsome businessman. What he said went. So the company went about purchasing several properties in Manhattan so they could own an entire block and build their new headquarters.
They were successful over time. It took years, except for the church.
There was what the Chinese would call a stubborn nail in Wriston's plans. A church that would only allow the sale of the land to go ahead under one condition.
The pastor of that church was really forward-thinking. He was shrewd. He understood the value of his corner. And he knew that whoever was going to construct anything on that lot or on that block was going to need him. So they ultimately worked a deal with the bank where they would get a brand new church building, but it had to be in the exact same spot.
Wriston would have his skyscraper, but it would have to be constructed up and over a new St. Peter's Lutheran Church. Citigroup could build their new headquarters anywhere around the church, including in the airspace above it. They chose all of the above. They would build their skyscraper on stilts. But the location of the church meant that those stilts couldn't sit under each corner of the building, which would be the safest and strongest place to put them. If they did that, one would basically pierce straight through the new church roof. So the architect of Citigroup Centre, Hugh Stubbins, knew he was going to need one hell of a structural engineer, and he turned to his friend, William LeMessurier.
He was known for his quick wit, academic prowess, unbelievable intellect, compulsively detailed, also extremely creative. He had done some projects, such as the Boston City Hall,
which is one of the best brutalist buildings in the U.S., was one of his designs.
Now affectionately known as the ugliest building on the face of the earth. The Citicorp Tower, I think, was the first major skyscraper, certainly in New York, that he had done. And after completion of that building, his career catapulted.
In the 70s, he was, pretty much at the peak of his career.
As the story goes, they met for lunch at a Greek restaurant, and LeMessurier took out a napkin and sketched the building with the stilts in the middle of the facade.
The placement of those columns in the middle rather than on the edges of the building meant the skyscraper would face some pretty significant engineering challenges.
These challenges would have to be solved using things that we might regard today as pretty primitive.
The 70s is sort of a transition era for structural engineering. Mini computers were available to do frame analysis, but they were expensive and slow. What you have to keep in mind is that, very large buildings up until the 50s were done entirely by hand calculation using relatively very primitive analysis methods. It was a time when things are changing very rapidly. The building was analyzed using two-dimensional analyses, one for wind blowing north-south and one for wind blowing east-west. It was not how it would have been analyzed 10 years earlier, and it was not how it would have been analyzed 10 years later.
Now, architects don't plan out skyscrapers on paper alone anymore, and as someone who spends quite a bit of time in those towers, that's a big old relief to me. Now today, 3D modelling with CAD software is pretty much second nature, but if you're using anything like an old PC, even opening up some simple editing software could send it into a full-blown meltdown, which is exactly why we've partnered with AMD and their Threadripper Pro 7000WX series, a processor that's built for some serious workloads. It massively takes the pressure off, handling demanding software, big design files, and complex workflows with ease. You can generate photorealistic renders, run detailed simulations, and even jump between tools without that dreaded lag. Its high-frequency cores pair seamlessly with platforms like Autodesk Revit and Metashape, which is especially useful if you've just designed a skyscraper on stilts and need to see how it's going to perform in quartering winds without flattening half a city. With up to 96 cores of processing power, this thing is seriously hench and built to keep up with whatever project you're trying to deliver. Guys, you can hit the link in the description or scan that QR code on screen to see how AMD can support your next project. Video sponsors like AMD help us bring you stories like the one you're watching now, so we really would appreciate you going to check them out.
LeMessurier would create a series of complicated engineering solutions to compensate for the stilts being in the middle of the facade. Normally, the corners of a skyscraper are one of the strongest parts of the building, but that wouldn't be the case here.
To address that, the building was fitted with a series of chevron-shaped braces that helped to redistribute its weight.
All of the weight of this building would have to be redirected towards the middle using those triangle-shaped braces.
Something that may not be obvious to a lot of people, gravity load is not the problem in a very tall building. Lateral load, wind load or seismic load is where all the effort goes.
The system was really a set of structurally independent chevrons, each of them 8 stories in height and intersected by massed columns vertically extending the entire length of the building. And the purpose of this was to basically gather the wind stresses against the building and channel them down through the mass columns, down to the bottom truss, and into the centrally placed legs at the bottom of the tower. It was ingenious.
The weight of the building would also have to be significantly lighter than that of other skyscrapers to accommodate that kind of structural engineering. It made the skyscraper susceptible to strong winds, so to stop it from swaying too much, a tuned mass damper was installed at the building's crown. This fully automatic tuned mass damper would counteract any unintentional movements of the high-rise building. It was kind of unprecedented in New York. It would stop the building from swaying in the wind and creating too much discomfort for those inside.
In general, they're not used for structural safety. In other words, you don't count on the tuned mass damper to keep your building from falling over. What they're used for is to reduce the motion because that's what people perceive. And people get very upset when there's noticeable motion in a tall building.
One of my professors, Professor Scanlon, had been consulted on the development of that and was able to bring a group of his students up to see it. We experienced a bit of a test where they excited the damper and then kicked it over into action, and it quickly tamped down the movement. It's one thing to study things in the classroom and do computer analysis, and it's another thing to see in real life.
The officers at Citicorp were a bit concerned about the public relations aspect of putting this block of concrete at the top of the building to stop what? Building movement, building sweat. You mean people could get like viscerally sick, from the building movement?
Of course, tuned mass dampers are now incredibly common in skyscrapers. The most famous one in Taipei 101 is even displayed for the public to view. Nowadays, it's pretty uncommon for a high-rise in New York to be constructed without one. LeMessurier had done the impossible and solved the engineering challenges associated with the center stilts. The skyscraper rose on the New York skyline and opened in 1977 as the 7th tallest building in the world. By all accounts, it was a great success. LeMessurier even toured the country giving lectures on his engineering ingenuity.
Everyone knew, even when the building was being constructed, that this was something special. This was something new and interesting on the skyline.
But barely a year later, a university student using the building as a case study discovered a terrifying problem with its design.
It seemed to have a lot of aspects that would make for a very interesting thesis. So I wrote up some thoughts and approached David Billington, and he agreed to take me on as an advisor. He was concerned because the building was already standing that I might need to delve a little deeper. The engineering team in New York City had been very kind and generous to me when I had approached them. I wound up taking a bus or a train up to New York and spent a day with the engineers. They were very gracious, and they sent me back to school with a complete set of engineering drawings and calculations for the project.
Citicorp and the engineering team were at first so enthusiastic of Diane's thesis, They offered her $10,000 to turn it into a coffee table book once she'd finished.
They were interested in leveraging the work I was doing on the thesis. They thought it would fit nicely into their PR plans. I had left some of what I considered the easier analyses to the end. I was wrapping it up and went to do the wind analysis. But when it came time to double check the quartering wind analysis, which I had determined would yield a 42% higher loading, I didn't see those calculations.
LeMessurier had taken into account the winds that act perpendicular to the skyscraper, but neglected the quartering winds that would hit the building on its corners. Now, the corners of skyscrapers, as I said, are usually the strongest part of the building, but the corners of this building aren't attached to anything on the ground, they just float above it.
So I assumed I was missing something. So I do remember making a call back to the office probably a week or two before my final deadline. It didn't quite make sense to me, but at the time, given my status as a student, I essentially just took his words verbatim. I remember being frustrated because I assumed I'd made a mistake and it didn't make sense to me, but neither did I feel I had put my finger on something that was any sort of an issue. However, when I got my comments back from my thesis advisor, David Billington, he clearly put his finger on that and said, no, this is not quite right. The academic course year was over and everyone moved on. And obviously, if any one of us had thought it was very, very critical, we would have done something else and not just let it go.
She's certainly not in over her head, because the final result was breathtaking. She produced a 460-page, double-volume, leather-bound thesis with 440 endnotes. It was a treatise, and it was a complete study of, the cultural, political, and structural ramifications of the Citicorp Tower.
So what about that $10,000 coffee table book?
Alas, they never returned my call, and after about 2 or 3 months, I gave up and went and got a real job.
Who was Diane Hartley to argue with these highly accomplished engineers? So she drops it and assumes she was the one who made a mistake.
She adopts the conclusions, she moves on with her life. At the same time, another student in New Jersey, an architectural student by the name of Lee DeCarolis. He's an undergraduate also. He's a freshman. He knows nothing. Other than his professor has said to him, you need to write a paper, and you could probably write a good paper about the Citicorp Tower.
This student reaches similar conclusions thanks to help from his professor. He reaches out to the engineering team for Citicorp Tower and actually gets through to LeMessurier.
He's in a meeting, and he gets interrupted by his secretary. It says, there's a student on the phone. His professor says that the columns on the Citicorp Tower were placed in the wrong location. And LeMessurier bristles, because he's an academic, he's a professor, and his curiosity piques. So he leaves the room and he takes the call.
LeMessurier dismisses the second student's claims, much like his engineering team dismissed Diane Hartley. Except LeMessurier now has a nagging feeling of dread. Did he miscalculate the engineering?
He starts taking some notes and preparing some calculations, and he starts realizing as he's doing the calculations that it's what he called some very peculiar behavior.
He ran the calculations again and got the shock of his life. Instead of decreasing under quartering wind loads, the calculated load on the steel beams increased by 40%. That's bad enough, but it gets worse. To save money, the beams were not welded and were connected with cheap bolts. LeMessurier only learnt of that after the fact.
The engineer says, Bill, didn't you know? We bolted those. We didn't weld them. The owner was offered a $200,000 reduction in price if they went with bolts rather than full penetration welds.
So there were two issues with the Skyscraper.
Usually when you have a problem of this magnitude, it's not from one cause. There are multiple things added together that lead to that problem. First issue is the legs being on the middle of each side and the effect that has on the wind analysis. If it was just that issue, there wouldn't have been any need for reinforcing.
And the second issue was that these bolts in the bracing system weren't welded down. And they weren't welded down because no one knew about the first issue.
The bolted connections were not as strong as the welded connections, but they were still stronger than the analysis showed was necessary.
In the case of quartering wind, the load of the connections would increase by 160%. LeMessurier now realised these bolts would not be enough to hold. A storm like this would also be likely to cause a citywide blackout, which was common at the time. It would also render the tuned mass damper completely ineffective, not that the damper would be much use anyway. A storm with winds this strong hits New York on average once every 16 years. That means every year there was a 1 in 16 chance that the world's 7th tallest building could flatten everything around it. Oh, and they came to that realization just as the city was in hurricane season, when winds like this were expected. It really can't be overstated how much of a disaster this was, and how much worse it could get.
At that point, he's faced with the ultimate dilemma. He is convinced it will destroy his career if he discloses. He's also convinced if he doesn't disclose, thousands of lives are potentially at risk, and therein is the ethical problem that he's confronting.
LeMessurier later stated that he wavered between suicide and silence. He knew that if this got out, not only would his career be over, but there could be mass panic in the city.
He contemplated suicide. He thought, on the way home from Maine, what if I just drove my car into an abutment? I end it all. I don't have to deal with this. He realized that was the coward's way out. He didn't want his children to reflect on him in that light. And so he decided, really in an epiphany, that disclosure was the only course of action. He described really having a weight lifted off of him when he reached that conclusion. There really was no other possibility.
It was at that point LeMessurier realised he had insurance, so he calls a meeting.
He has to now disclose to this room full of insurance people and lawyers that despite outward appearances, there's a problem with the building, and here's why, and here's what it is.
They tell him that he absolutely has to tell the bank. To LeMessurier's surprise, Citicorp's CEO Walter Wriston remained calm at these revelations. They would just have to fix it, and quickly. LeMessurier worked with the Citicorp higher-up to organise emergency repairs on the building. Leslie Robertson, who engineered the Twin Towers, was called in to assist with a solution.
The actual physical fix was pretty straightforward. If you reinforce the connections in the braces, those spliced connections, and make them strong enough for the actual forces, then the problem is solved. So the fix was to open up the gypsum board, weld plates onto the braces to reinforce the splices, and then put the gypsum board back.
LeMessurier and Roberts proposed welding 2-inch steel plates over 200 bolt connections of the column system. Construction workers welded throughout the night, stopping at daybreak just as the building's occupants came into work. The repairs were kept secret, and people using the building knew nothing about them. Citicorp's CEO Walter Wriston, as well as the emergency responders, agreed not to let the public know to avoid creating mass panic.
The building department was involved with this, and they made the decision that there was no need to evacuate everybody around the building unless there was evidence of a direct hit coming. And the nice thing about hurricanes is you do know a few days in advance, so there would be plenty of time.
Carpenters appeared every afternoon at 5 p.m, erecting wooden sheds around the beams. The offices in the Citicorp Centre were empty, but it didn't stay that way for long. With the greatest possible secrecy, teams of welders came in. They tore open the wall coverings and concentrated on the steel plates. For 8 hours, they worked to reinforce the columns until several cleanup teams came by at around 4 AM. By the time the first office staff arrived at 8 AM, it looked as if nothing had happened. The NYPD worked out an evacuation plan spanning a 10-block radius. 2,500 Red Cross volunteers were on standby, and 3 different weather services were employed 24/7 to keep an eye on potential windstorms.
Remember, a collapse of a high-rise building is seared into our minds, tragically, as a building that simply falls into itself. In the case of the Citicorp Tower, the concern was that if one of the splices fractured, they were all going to break, and the building would topple. It wouldn't collapse, it would topple left or right. It could be a domino effect. It could collapse into other buildings, which could in turn collapse into further buildings, and it could have been an absolute nightmare.
So they enlisted the help of the Red Cross, local and state government and first responders, and developed an evacuation plan.
But they did the evacuation plan quietly. They said they were canvassing the neighborhood for some type of survey because they wanted to know and needed to know how many people could be potentially affected by a problem with this building. And so, the question became, when do these evacuation plans go into effect?
There are a lot of smaller buildings nearby, and as we found out with the World Trade Center, when a large building falls from a large height, it wipes out everything it hits.
Of course, the welding work didn't go completely unnoticed, as people could see lights on in the building. A New York Times reporter even got suspicious and called LeMessurier. But before they could dig too deep into the story, the newspapers went on strike and nobody ended up finding out. Things were finally back on track when, on August 31st, a massive storm moving towards New York was given hurricane status.
Hurricane Ella began heading for the East Coast, began veering northward. That's when LeMessurier said we were sweating blood.
Hurricane Ella was reaching speeds of up to 137 miles an hour, making it the strongest hurricane ever recorded on Canadian waters. The welders had to act fast. The work couldn't be done in time for when the hurricane was predicted to make landfall. This was it. Citigroup, LeMessurier and the city's emergency responders prepared to make a public statement and evacuate the surrounding blocks. They would undoubtedly face backlash for keeping this a secret for a full month. The damage to the city would be in the millions. But at the 11th hour, the hurricane dissipated and didn't reach New York. The city wasn't notified, and this disastrous secret was kept. The welders finished their work 12 days later, and no one was any wiser. LeMessurier is at a dinner party. Life is good. His legacy and career remain intact. Citigroup Centre is a distant and resolved drama. The authorities and Citigroup agreed to mutual confidentiality, and that suited everybody just fine. Feeling comfortable, and after one too many drinks at this party, LeMessurier started to tell a friend about the story, and who overheard it? Joe Morgenstern, a writer for The New Yorker.
He checked out the story and he learned it was true. So he started making phone calls, and he got a contract, an assignment with New Yorker magazine to write a piece that he called the 59-Story Crisis, about the Citicorp engineering crisis. And he contacted LeMessurier, and LeMessurier said, I've been waiting for this phone call, In the one sense, dreading it. In the other sense, happy to have it, because now the story could be told. The building was safe, and LeMessurier was able to freely and openly tell his story.
The story became public in 1995 when it was published in The New Yorker.
It's funny, I read it while waiting in my dentist's office. He had The New Yorker in the waiting room, and about a week later, everybody started talking about it. What's interesting is it caused a lot of discussion among engineers, but not so much among the general public. It was, I was surprised at how little public discussion there was of this, in part because it was already an 18-year-old issue. It was solved.
After 1995, there was a lot of writing in the technical fields and in the trades about what are the obligations of structural professionals. And almost uniformly, LeMessurier was praised, and he should be, for his actions here. But there were some grumblings as well that they should have been more forthright. Other engineers could have benefited from the information. If you work in this building, wouldn't you have wanted to know that there was a flaw in this building? At least you would have been given a choice.
Apart from being news to the rest of the world, it was also news to the very person who discovered the engineering blunder, Diane Hartley.
And it really wasn't until about 1996 there had been a show about the problem, a televised show about the problem. I remember vividly, I was upstairs with my younger son, who would have been about a year or a year and a half, and my husband was watching this show, and he started yelling upstairs, honey, your thesis building is on TV. I went to our bedroom, turned on the television just in time to see the description of the problem that was discovered, and the fact that it was an engineering student from New Jersey.
She's so modest and humble about all of this. She's named as the savior of New York City, and all these accolades falling on her, and she's confused about it a little bit.
It's surreal, and it's also the fact that I was totally unaware at the time that this was all going on. And what's also surreal, and maybe more surreal, because I think people discover problems every day. And, serendipity, there are things that happen just in the nick of time, and I think it's part of the mystery of life.
The Citigroup Tower now stands safely on the New York skyline and has become one of the world's most famous engineering case studies.
I went to some of the younger engineers in my office, and I asked if they knew about this, and they did. They were taught it as a story of, don't let this happen to you. And another was taught it in an engineering ethics class. So it is still being taught to engineers in school. It's very hard to fault him for anything he did from the moment he found out there might be a problem, in my opinion.
I might withhold judgment on that because I don't know. I only know what I've read. There's so many different tellings of the story. And having worked in an engineering firm and knowing practices and protocols and all of that, I don't know. I really don't know the truth there, but there's a lot of pressure in the industry. There's a lot of stress. And I don't know if that piece of the industry, that aspect of the industry is properly supported as it should be.
It's not just every engineer makes mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. And the engineering profession is set up to try to catch mistakes as best we can. But in this case, it was two independent issues that caused the problem, so there was no one review that caught it. I think most engineers I know, this is the kind of thing that wakes us up in the middle of the night. Have I remembered to review everything?
Part of it is the ethics, the fact that an engineer went public with an issue, all of these things, nothing went perfectly. It's human nature. And so I think all we can do as professionals and teachers and students is to be mindful of these near misses and try to focus and get things as right as we can, knowing that we're all human and we will make mistakes.
Today, we have wind simulation programs and complex computing software to ensure this sort of thing would never happen again. But it's startling to think how close this building came to disaster.
Don't forget guys, if you haven't already, go and check out that link down there in the video description. The AMD Threadripper is a seriously impressive bit of kit that could have a big impact on your next project.
And as always guys, if you enjoyed this video and you want to get more from the definitive video channel for construction, make sure you're subscribed to the B1M.